Last time we were talking about RNA secondary structure, and I mentioned a lot about the, in sort of a hand-waving way, the biological background of this problem, but ultimately it boils down to the following thing. We have a string. It's using 4 letters, or an alphabet of 4 letters, A, T, C, G. And we're permitted to pair pairs of A and U, and C and G are permitted. But we have 4 conditions. Well, this is part of them. We have 4 conditions that have to hold in getting a secondary structure. One, I don't remember the order in which I did this last time, although this time I brought notes. So I think this is what's used in the book. I less than j minus 4. So pairs of AU are permitted in positions I and j. So I-J pair, but this is one condition that has to hold, that there has to be at least 4 positions between I and j. Okay, they can't be neighbors, they can't be too close. That's one condition. The second condition is actually what was written up here. Only A can pair with U, and conversely, and C can pair with G. Okay? Third condition is that the pairing has to be a matching. Pairing forms a matching. And what that means is that each position is involved in at most one pair. So a position is in at most one pair. And then the most important condition put here for if IJ, and I think last time I said I prime, J prime, are paired or matched in the secondary structure, then I less than I prime less than J less than J prime is prohibited. Prohibited. Okay. And what does that look like? This is I prime, J prime. If the indices have that relation, if I is matched to J and I prime is matched to J prime, then you have a crossover there. And so what this is saying is that you're not permitted any crossovers. So we had pictures of a secondary structure last time that had this sort of picture. Okay, something like that showed the actual pairings or the matching that was permitted. So we can now make up a sequence. If this is A, what's this one? That's U, right? AU. And if this is a C, this one over here is a G, and if this is a G, this is a C, and etc. Okay, CG. And have I done? Yeah, I guess that's a, what happened? That's a G, that's a G. This is, let's say, a U. That's an A. And this is a C, G. So in that sequence, this is a permitted, oops, is this a permitted secondary structure? No, why? Yeah.
Because we're supposed to have at least 4 more in between the appearance.
Right. Okay. This condition, which I last time said was kind of a nuisance, at least in terms of the algorithmic problem, but does mirror the biology and appropriately. That wouldn't. That would prohibit C from matching. It would prohibit a lot of these things. So we'll just put a lot of A's inside here, okay, and put a lot of U's inside here or whatever. And now this sequence would allow this secondary structure. Okay, and the problem is with all these conditions, we want to find a secondary structure that maximizes the number of these pairings. Because each pairing in the actual folding of the molecule represents a bond. And the more bonds you have, the more stable the structure is. The more, even in 2 dimensions, well, you're seeing the number of bonds there in 2-dimensional representation. Maybe in 3 dimensions you get some additional ones, I don't know. But even in 2 dimensions, if you have a large number of bonds, that's at least at the way this problem was first modeled, that was believed to be one of the more likely folds or secondary structures for the RNA. And that actually, I believe, I'm not a molecular biologist, but and I didn't even stay at Howard Johnson's last night, or however that ad goes. Anyway, I think this has been relatively successful, at least at the beginning of this investigation into RNA secondary structure, to have this model. Okay, but just purely back to the algorithmic question, how do we maximize problem given a string, a sequence, whatever you want to call it? We want to find a secondary structure to maximize the number of pairs. Okay? So, as I said last time, we have several algorithmic strategies we've looked at. We've looked at divide and conquer. It's possible there's a divide and conquer approach here, but it seems pretty involved if there was one. Greedy algorithms. We thought a little bit about greedy algorithms last lecture, and I said no greedy algorithm that I know of actually works, and you can think of various greedy algorithms, matching a character to its closest permitted complement or to its farthest permitted complement or whatever. You can find examples where they fail to find the maximum. So what we have left, and what we're talking about in general right now, is dynamic programming. So dynamic programming. Well, in dynamic programming, the first thing you do is you invent notation that's related to a recurrence. So it's sort of circular, because you have to have the recurrence in mind to get good notation, and you have to have good notation to express your recurrence. And so this is sort of where the most creative part comes in. You just have to play with various recursive ideas until you hit on one that seems likely to succeed, and then you have to do the analysis and the details and see if you're right. So here's one that people have found for this problem. Opt_ij is defined as, this is really a definition, this is defined as the secondary structure that maximizes the number of pairs well, under the condition we restrict attention to the subinterval, the subsequence between I and j. So you have a long RNA molecule between positions 1 and n, and subproblems of interest that we're going to restrict our attention to are the ones that occur between a position I and a position j. So it may not be clear why we're picking this kind of substructure, but it should be clear this is a subproblem because I and j, well, I should have said, of course, I is greater than or equal to 1 and j is less than or equal to n. They're in the proper range, and I is less than j. Well, for technical reasons, we're going to have the possibility of equal. It doesn't really make sense the way I just wrote it, like that. So we're looking at different subintervals, and with this notation, what is the problem we're trying to find or trying to solve? What's the ultimate problem we're trying to then solve? Anybody on that side? Yes. Yeah, we ultimately would like to find opt between 1 and n because that's everything. Okay? Now, the previous problem we looked at had just a single parameter. The previous problem was the interval question. And there was only a single parameter, which was you can consider intervals between 1 and j, and then you increase j all the way to n. Here we have two parameters. Okay. It's not clear why we need two parameters. Why don't we just have one? What if I just invented opt of j again is the optimal solution, the best folding or secondary structure between 1 and j, and then opt of n would be what we wanted. Okay? And so why do I have two parameters instead of one? Right, good answer. Because nobody knows how to do a recursive solution to this problem with just a single parameter. Okay, just if you find one, I mean, as I said, you invent the notation related to the recurrence you have in mind, and the recursions that people have thought of for this problem all involve intervals, arbitrary intervals in here, as opposed to intervals that are only starting at position 1 and going to various positions in here. So you could invent the notation opt j. It's just that when you try to go to the recurrence for that, you might get stuck because so far everybody has with just a single parameter. But two parameters has worked. Okay. So this is why I said this is the most creative part, and to some extent it's hard to teach. It's hard to say how people came up with this except just to show you. And then once you see enough of these examples and try some, you start to get good at it yourself. Okay, opt of j, ij has this meaning. And so now we want a recurrence for opt ij. Well, actually here, people have come up with a lot of different alternative recurrences, and some are better in some aspects than others. But let me follow the ones that are in the book. So opt ij. Well, first of all, we need the base case. Okay. So what happens if I and j are too close? Because we have this condition over here that they have to have at least 4 characters in between. Okay. So if they're too close, and we're trying to maximize here, we're trying to get as many pairs as possible. If I and j are too close, then what should opt ij be? 0, right. So opt ij equals 0, and this is if I is greater than or equal to j minus 4. Okay? That seems a little funny, right? What do we have over here? We had I was less than, yeah, I is required to be less than j minus 4. So, yeah, the opposite is I guess that makes sense. I greater than or equal to j minus 4. Why this seems a little funny to me is because this even allows I to be bigger than j. But technically, that's fine. We wanted I to be less than j. Okay, so if we say technically when I is bigger than j, then definitely that should be 0. And actually in the recurrence, I think it'll be useful, you'll see in a minute, to have included one of those cases where I is actually bigger. Okay, so that's your base case. And then the general case, opt ij, well, always when you're inventing the recurrences, you're thinking recursively about the problem. In this case, it's I through j. And you think about how does it relate to smaller instances, subproblems, with a kind of case analysis. Something happens or something doesn't happen. And this is why I said there are actually many ways of writing these recurrences. People have come up with different ones. But here is one. We look at the character in position j, and there are two possibilities for that character. Either that's used in a pair, okay, or it's not. Okay, the character that's in position j may or may not be used, and that does cover all the cases. So if it's not used in position, if it's not used in a match, then what is the best thing that you can do using characters between I and j? If you're not going to use the character in position j, what's the best you can do? Yeah, you can use the characters between I and j minus 1 in the best possible way. And what's the notation for that, or for that value? Yeah.
So I and j minus
1. Right, opt of I minus to j minus 1. So this is one possibility, opt of I to j minus 1. So this is the best possible value you can get. Okay, so I guess I didn't emphasize one thing. Opt ij, secondary structure at maximum. This is actually the value of. Okay, so this is a number, not an actual secondary structure. And that's very typical of dynamic programming. Your recurrences are talking about values or costs, and then later through traceback you'll actually find the actual description of the solution that gives you that value. So opt ij is equal to the best you can do if you just use characters between I and j minus 1. Okay? Well, the other possibility is that j is going to be used in some pair. And what does it pair with? The character in some position. Let's say it's position t. Okay? So you get 1 for that pairing. Okay? For that pair, the pair of j to t, and then having made that pair, and we'll have to put some conditions. What are the conditions on t, by the way? It's what? It has to be far enough away. And what's the other condition? Yeah.
It has to be the type that matches.
Right. The characters in position t and j have got to be complementary. They have to be one of those two pairs that are permitted. Okay? So we'll write that in a minute. But assuming that you can actually pair j with t, then if that's going to be part of the solution, or that's going to be part of the secondary structure, what's the rest of the secondary structure look like? You're not permitted to cross this. Okay? You can't have a pairing that starts over here somewhere and ends in there. That's not permitted. Okay? You also can't have a pairing that starts over here and goes to j, because j is only permitted to match to be in one pair, right? And you can't have a pairing that goes from here beyond j, because we're only looking at the interval between I and j. So if j is going to pair with t, then what else do we know, or what else can we say about the rest of the secondary structure? Yeah.
Well, anything that's between I and t minus 1 would be okay, so we can put in opt
Right. So something in here, and what else?
And also anything between t plus 1 and t minus 1.
Yeah. Okay, this is very messy. So I'll put it over here. It's 1, that's for it's the j through t. Then we have opt of 1 through t minus 1 plus opt of t plus 1 through j minus 1. So I'm going to redraw this. This is just really messy. So if you have j matching t, then the only things you can have left over, you can have a match, a secondary structure, a permitted secondary structure between I and t minus 1. And you want to have the best possible one, the one that maximizes the number of pairs in that range. And you can have one from t plus 1 through j minus 1. And you want to have the best one that you can have there. So you get 1 for the tj match, and then you do the best in here and the best in here. And then, of course, this is only if the characters in positions t and j can pair. Okay, and can pair means they're far enough apart and they're complementary characters. I'm not going to write that down. Okay, well, what is t? I said it just, j, the character in position j is going to match the character in position t, and then we're going to have these two subproblems. But which t do you take? Yeah. The leftmost t that's permitted? Okay, you might think that that's a possible strategy. I think when you play with examples, you'll find that that doesn't always work. Okay, if you use that rule, you can run into examples where you won't, in the end, get the best possible secondary structure. Any other suggestions? Yeah. The rightmost, okay. No, that won't be any better. What about the middlemost? That won't be any better. Okay. What's left? What's left is everything. Okay? You've got to try them all. You have to maximize your choice. I've got too many brackets here. That, that, this, that. Maximize over t. T is less than j minus 4, right? And greater than or equal, or greater than I. Let's try that. Oh, no, we want to permit I. Yeah, it's possible that j matches I. Okay, that's possible. That's the pairing, and so we have to allow that. So this is saying inside this part, you want to look at all possible t's in the right range, and of course you're only going to consider those t's that can pair. But for each one of those that can pair, you get a 1 for that pairing, and then you get the best from the two subproblems. Okay, so this is when j doesn't match. This first term is when j is not in any pairing, any pair. This is when j is in a pair, a permitted pair with t, and you have to explicitly consider all t's that are in the right range. And so you want to look at the two of these, and what do you want to do between this one option and the max of these various options? What do you want to do? Yeah. Yeah, pick the biggest. So there's a max here also. So this is a bracket that matches with that one, and then here's a parenthesis that matches with this parenthesis. Okay? I suppose you could have just had a single max out here, and but this is the way it's written in the book. And so it's the max of this option and the max of these options. And when you've done that, that tells you what an opt ij is. Okay? So this recurrence considers all. You should be able to convince yourself that the recurrence is right because it considers all possibilities. Either J is not in any pair in that interval, or it is, in which case it's matched to some, it's in a pair with some T, and of course that position T, or the characters there, have got to be allowed. And when you do that, then you have two subproblems, one inside here and one inside there. And we're considering explicitly all possible T, so everything is covered. You really you've considered all the possibilities. So it's explicit here. This recurrence looks right. Yeah?
In the second part of the max, the 1 plus opt, should it be an I to T minus 1? Or is that
Yes, right, sorry. Yeah. That's an I to T minus 1. And this is a J. Yeah. Okay. So the correctness is clear. You could write an inductive proof to even be more formal about it, but it's pretty clear this is right. Now, the second issue in dynamic programming, once you have the recurrence relation, is how you're going to evaluate it. What's the order in which you're going to actually fill in these values, find these values. Okay, so now we have opt parameterized by two parameters. So we now need a two-dimensional table, not just a one-dimensional table. So we'll have that. And to find an ordering, when I say how do you want to solve it, it means what's the order in which you're going to look at the ij? How are you going to vary those values from I and j? And the answer to that is that, or there can be many answers, but the answer has to satisfy the recurrences. You have to, if you come up with a scheme for how you're going to vary I and j, that scheme has to satisfy the property that whenever you want to solve opt ij with the recurrence, you have available already the values that are called for in the recurrence. You have to have opt ij minus 1 already computed. And you have to have opt I t minus 1 in the proper range and t plus 1 through j minus 1 in the proper range already computed. So that's your constraint. So how do you, you can think of various possibilities. If I do like this, for example, for I equals 1 to n minus 4, for j equals I plus 4 to n, whatever. Yeah, is that going to work? Compute opt ij. Okay, so if we're looking at, here's I, here's j, this is the opt table. These things really are annoying. I'm just going to get rid of them. Okay, so if I and j are too close, then the recurrence will tell you, forget it. Okay, but certainly we're running through all values of I and j here, right? Well, all the values where I is less than or equal to j. Okay, so we're certainly running through all the relevant values. But at the moment where I want to compute opt ij, if I do it in this order, is it going to work? Well, you look over here at the recurrence, okay, and this says you need opt of I j minus 1. Do you have the opt of I j minus 1 at that moment? I is running from 1 to n, and j is running from I up through n. Okay, so the moment when you wanted ij, you have already looked at ij minus 1. So that seems okay. At the moment when you want ij, opt ij, you can get opt ij minus 1. You can just look it up. It's already been computed. What about this one? Okay, opt I t minus 1. What's the relationship of t minus 1 to j? It's less. So this is also available or unavailable? It's available. And what about this one? This is opt of t plus 1 through j minus 1. What's the relationship of t plus 1 to I? It's bigger, right? So when you want to compute opt ij, is this available or not? It's not available. Okay? If we're using that ordering of the ij variables or ij indices, at this moment if you're trying to evaluate this recurrence by looking for ij, it tells you should look up what opt of t plus 1 j minus 1 is, and you don't have it in the bottom-up dynamic programming approach. If you're doing a top-down, this is fine, but we've already skipped over that. We don't want to do top-down. That would be tremendously inefficient. So this ordering isn't going to work. But everybody understand what I mean now by ordering? How are you going to, in what order of the ij parameters are you going to evaluate opt ij? So anybody have any other suggestions? The distance between I and j should increment. Yes, that's exactly right. That will work. So we want to look at all values of I and j that are, let's say, 1 away, where I and j are 1 away. Well, of course, they'll all be 0. Then 2 away, then 3 away, then 4 away. So I and j, the distance between them is increasing. And then you see when you want to evaluate opt of ij for these two parameters, well, this distance between I and j minus 1 is less than the distance between I and j, and this is less than I and j, and this is less than the distance between I and j. So these should all be available. And so that should work. Well, let me write this down in some pseudocode. It might be a little clearer if you haven't seen the idea yet. Where we're assuming the base case. Well, okay. So opt ij equals 0 for I greater than or equal to j minus 4, and then for k equals 5 through n minus 1, for I equals 1 through n minus k, j equals I plus k, and then you compute opt ij using the recurrence. So, whatever. And then you can return opt 1 through n ultimately. Okay? So you may want to parse this a little bit. This is exactly what's in the book, so if you don't need to really write it down right now. But this is just saying we're going to look at the values of I and j in increasing distance between I and j. Initially, and the distance parameter here is k. K is the distance between I and j. It's being used. So I is going to range from 1 through n minus k, and j is going to be I plus k. That's the distance away from it. N minus k. Yeah, I mean, that's right. Okay, so you're looking at all those distances, all the distances between I and j in these two, anyway, in this pseudocode. Okay, so you could evaluate opt ij by using this organization. There are other ways of doing it. This looking at distances between I and j is sort of the one that's I guess the first one that was successful that people looked at, and that's the one you'll find in all the textbooks on RNA folding or secondary structure. It turns out there's a way of organizing that looks more natural, where you can actually have I and j incrementing in a more regular way and not in this distance between them. And maybe I'll try to cook up a homework question for you to discover that organization. But the first organization we looked at didn't work. This one does work, and this is the one that's well known. Now, if you look at the table and you're trying to sort of draw in the order in which these recurrences are being evaluated, these values are being evaluated, it looks like you're going along on the off diagonal. Okay, so this is where I equals j, and this is where j is 1 bigger than I. This is where j is 2 bigger than I, 3 bigger than I, 4 bigger than I. Well, according to this, all of these would be 0 until you got out here. Of course, my scale here is very bad because most of the action is happening there, which I left very little room for. But generally, that's a large part. But the point is that according to the way these loops are set, you're going to be filling in the values along here, and then the next one is going to be along there, and so on. Okay. So if you're having trouble visualizing what's going on here, just think about it going that way. Okay, now we can ask, so now we have a correct set of recurrences. We have a way of evaluating them that looks correct. What's the time complexity? How much time does this does it take to evaluate all the values, that is to fill in this table and finally return opt of 1n? Well, you can do the analysis by just looking at the pseudocode, right? Okay, so you have 2 loops here. Each one goes through at most n times. In fact, well, they both go less than n times, but this one goes less than n times, and each time this is entered, this goes less than n times. But you can think of this as going n times, and this is going n times inside of that. Okay, and then, so how many times does this compute statement get reached? At most n squared. You've got an n on the outer, n on the inner, that's at most n squared. And then when you're actually computing opt of ij, you're doing that by using the recurrence here. And how many operations are involved in computing opt ij? At most, what? N. Who said n? N. Yeah, at most n, because you have to look at every t in the proper range. You're looking at t's in the proper range. The range is at most n. That's the biggest size of the range. And for any fixed j and t, you're looking this up, that's 1 operation. You're looking this up, that's 2. You're adding them, that's 3. You're making sure that they're permitted to be matched. Maybe you should do that first. But anyway, that's a handful of operations. That's constant. You're looking this up, that's another operation. You're comparing these two, that's another operation. So it's a constant number of operations for any ij. A constant number of operations, sorry, for every j and t. Constant number for j and t. And the number of t's that you have to consider is bounded by n. And then finally, when you found that max, you compare it to this. So that's another additional small number, 2. So overall, when you evaluate opt ij, how many operations can we bound? What bound should we use for the number of operations? I see your mouth move. What? What? Oh, okay, but the n cubed is the next question. Inside here, how much is it?
It's just n.
Right, inside here, this is just n. So for a fixed ij, it's bounded by n, or order n, but n. And outside here we have n squared. So this is something inside of here is big O of n. N squared around it means that the total time for this dp is big O of n cubed. Okay? And so this is the classic dynamic programming solution for this problem of RNA secondary structure. And its running time is big O of n cubed. Okay, and as I said, I'll try on some future homework to get you to discover a different way of organizing this computation that may seem a little bit more natural. Okay, so we've gone through 3 components of the dynamic programming. One is finding recurrences. The second is figuring out how we're going to evaluate them. When you do the evaluation, you tablize them. You put them in the table like this. We now know what the worst case running time is for doing that tableizing, evaluating all the values. What's left in dynamic programming typically? Yeah, understanding how to do the traceback. Okay, and the book actually doesn't give you any details of that. It just says, oh, and you can do the traceback in sort of the standard way. It only gave you one example of traceback so far, which was on the interval problems. So I think it's worthwhile thinking a little bit about how to do the traceback here. And let's just do it. Well, you can do it in 2 ways. One is the way the book presented it, which traceback generally, which is by following some algorithm. And the algorithm is going to have built into it the logic of the recurrences. But it's going to end up doing comparisons that you did anyway during your forward computation. By forward computation, I mean the computation you were doing when you filled in the table. This is the forward computation. You're filling in the table. And for every ij, you already know where the best value for opt ij comes from, or who was the winner in the in this recursion for opt ij. You know whether it was from this case or from this case, and if it's from this case, you know what the t was. There might be ties, but anyway, you know one winner, one that was just as good as any other. And so to do a traceback, you could go through these kinds of recurrences again, or you could have left pointers when we did the forward computation, and then on the traceback, you just have to follow the pointers appropriately. Well, I guess we might want to do both of those, at least informally. So having filled in the opt table, here's 1, here's n. Okay, so you finally have opt 1n sitting there, okay, and you can ask, well, how did I get there? What was the last action in the forward computation that got me there? Well, you were filling in opt 1n, and for that, you looked at opt 1n minus 1, or you considered all the values of t that would have paired with the character in position n, and you did this. And so who is the winner? If the winner was this, 1 through n minus 1, then I guess you just, let's just record this. Then where did the winner come from? It was opt of 1 n minus 1. So if you've recorded that there, in addition to the value, I guess I shouldn't just say this is the winner. It came from 1 n minus 1. So it's just saying the optimal, to get the opt of 1 through n, the winner there was to use this case, from 1 through n minus 1. So let's say we've recorded that there. What would the traceback do at this moment with this piece of information? We're trying to find the actual optimal solution, the optimal secondary structure. And if we had recorded that the winning part of the recurrence was this at the very last step, what does that mean in terms of the actual secondary structure? Yeah.
If we want to go look for the 1 n minus 1 and find what points to that.
Yes, we'll want to do that. But more, in addition to that, what else do we know? Yeah.
Know that n isn't part of isn't going to vary.
Yeah, we first know that tells us that the character in position n is not going to be part of the optimal secondary structure, and that in order to find the optimal secondary structure, we need to go over to 1 through n minus 1 and figure out what's going on there. So you can think of this as a pointer if you want that way. Now that's if that was the winner. Now the other possibility is that when we were filling in the table, the winner was that n matches with t. Okay? Matches with some position t. And if that's what's recorded there, and it's not the n minus 1 position, then how would we use that piece of information in doing the traceback? Well, yeah.
We go look at the opposite, the two I through t minus 1 and t plus 1 through t minus 1.
In addition to what? Yeah. N what? N and 1. No. N and t. So this is saying that the character in position n matches the character, is paired with the character in position t. So we know that's a little piece of what the optimal secondary structure looks like. We know that at this point. And then what was stated is correct. We would then have to recurse on looking for what was the optimal between 1 and t minus 1. So we'd look in that position, 1, whatever t happens to be. So it would be here, through 1 through t minus 1. We'd look in there. And we would have to look also at t plus 1, n minus 1. So wherever t is, let's say that's there, t minus 1, n minus 1. So we'd have to look in there. Okay? So we'd end up knowing a little bit about what the secondary structure should look like. N matches with t, and then we have two sub-problems that we have to look into. And the logic inside each one of these cells is exactly the same as what I did here. Once you look in here, you're going to see what was recorded there, and that's going to tell you a little bit more of what the optimal secondary structure looks like, and so on. Now, in this traceback, now you could be recursing two different ways. So it may not be as clear as when we were looking at the interval problem that the time complexity for doing the traceback is efficient. Okay? So the forward was n cubed. The backwards, we certainly don't want to be any more than n cubed. But actually, if you think about it, we'll try to do this next, or maybe I'll make it on a homework. When you think about the actual time that's going on in doing the traceback, you'll see that it's actually less than n cubed. And so the traceback is fairly is efficient as well. And so you could do the traceback by explicitly going through these recurrences backwards the way we were just laying it out, or you could have left pointers, and that's sort of the way I've been thinking about it here. Okay? Pointers when you're going forward. In this case, well, this is actually a notation, a shorthand for two different pointers. Okay.